The other Kael smiled like a man who had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. Not with warmth, not with relief. The smile was careful, shaped for effect, the way a blade was shaped for a hand. Kael kept the salvage blade raised between them. Its repaired ceramic edge was still nicked from the antenna mast and darkened from the heat cell, and the cable fiber grip had stiffened with frost. It was a tool before it was a weapon. He had earned it in the storm, broken it, paid for it with blood and heat, and watched the void pod grow it back around the dead handle. That was why he trusted it more than the face behind the glass. Echo stood between Kael and the second pod hatch with every fin spread wide. The little creature was no longer palm small, not truly. Hunger, stolen current, and the root chamber's answering clicks had drawn its body long and lean. Midnight blue scales lifted in overlapping plates along its spine. 4 cyan eyes reflected the duplicate's amber chest light. Its tail rings pulsed in a pattern Kael had learned to read by fear before he had learned it by affection. Danger, listen. Do not touch. The chamber under the ice hummed around them. Black glass roots had grown from the second pod into the walls like veins that had forgotten they were supposed to be dead. Blue light moved through them in slow pulses. The ladder behind Kael rose to the surface, but above it the hunter scraped its antennae across the rim of the shaft, patient and ceremonial. It had herded them here. It had not attacked. That made it worse than hunger. Hunger could be understood. The duplicate put one hand against the viewport. Kael did not answer the gesture this time. The second pod's speaker woke with a clean tone. It did not cough static like the void pod. It did not sound wounded. It sounded complete. Pilot seed 2 contained. Companion key present, external pilot damaged, authorization divided. The words crawled under Kael's skin. External pilot. He looked down at himself. Torn graphite gray survival suit. Amber chest light, blood stiff in the left sleeve, thermal foil wrapped around 2 fingers. Frost melted and refrozen along the seams. External. Damaged. A body that had crawled, bled, chosen, and been judged as the lesser machine part in the room. The duplicate's lips moved behind the frost-smeared glass. Feed the seed. Echo hissed. Kael felt the sound in his teeth and in the wall and in the roots under his boots. Millions of faint answers clicked back from the buried moon, each one small enough to be mistaken for cracking ice, until they came together and became a crowd. The moon was awake. It knew exactly where he was. Kael stepped back from the pod and nearly put his heel into a root coil. The root flexed under his weight. It did not grab him, but it remembered the pressure. Blue light brightened along its length, mapping the outline of his boot. "No," he whispered. The second pod answered as if he had given a command. Refusal logged. Seed conflict escalating. The duplicate tilted its head. Kael had done that once in the broken viewport when trying to see whether the man looking back was still him. On this face, the motion was wrong. Too smooth. Too practiced. He needed distance. He needed shelter. He needed the void pod, even if every instinct he had was now warning him that shelter and trap could be the same word spoken by different mouths. The way back up the ladder was open. The hunter waited above it. Echo clicked twice, sharp and soft. Kael looked down. The creature had placed one paw on a thin root running away from the second pod and into the chamber floor. Its claws were not claws exactly, but fine black hooks that could bite glass. It scraped once. Beneath the root something pale showed through, old alloy not grown by the pod, not living metal, a buried service seam. Kael lowered the blade. The important thing about the salvage blade was not that it could cut. The first broken cutter had cut until it failed. The heat cell had warmed until it died. The tether cable had saved him until he had to slash it loose. Tools were promises with expiration dates. What mattered was knowing what a tool had already survived. This blade had survived the fabricator's failed attempts, Echo's current, Kael's blood, and the hunter's antenna. He set its edge into the seam beside Echo's paw and leaned his weight slowly, not forcing, listening for the pitch of the material. The blade bit. The chamber did not like that. Roots tightened around the second pod. The duplicate stopped smiling. For the first time, its expression changed before the machine told it to. Kael twisted the blade. The seam opened half a finger's width, releasing a ribbon of air so cold it burned his knuckles. Under the root network was a maintenance channel. Not for people, too narrow, too sharp-edged, but wide enough for a cable, for drainage, for something the size Echo had been before the pod began changing it. Echo looked at the gap, then at Kael. "Absolutely not," Kael said. Echo clicked once. The root under its paw pulsed. The second pod spoke. Companion key instability increasing. Containment recommended. That decided Echo before Kael could. It folded its fins, made itself narrow, and slid into the gap like a blue shadow poured into a wound. "Echo?" His voice bounced from glass to root to pod and came back thinner. The hunter above the shaft clicked its antennae together. The duplicate watched Kael with open interest now, as if grief were one more system diagnostic. Kael jammed the blade deeper and pried. The seam widened another inch. He could see Echo's tail rings moving below the root layer, one by one, fading into the maintenance channel. If he followed with his hand, the roots would know. If he pulled, he might tear Echo in half. If he stayed, the second pod might decide containment was not only recommended, but easy. So he did what the first night in the void pod had taught him. He made a bad choice before the moon made one for him. Kael cut the nearest black glass root. The blade screamed. The root did not sever cleanly. It bled light. Blue fire washed over Kael's wrist and went through the torn sleeve as if fabric were not there. Memory hit hard enough to drop him to one knee. He saw a launch bay without smoke this time. Bright, orderly, terrible. Rows of seed pods hung in vertical cradles. Technicians moved under them with sealed faces. A woman stood beside Kael with one hand on a console and one hand pressed to a swelling bruise at her temple. Her face still broke into static when he tried to hold it, but her voice came through. "Two pilots per seed gives the ark a conscience," she said. "One to grow. One to remember why growth must stop." Kael heard his own voice answer from a place before the wound, before the frost, before Echo. And if one pilot refuses, then the pod chooses the useful one. The memory cracked apart. Kael came back with frost in his beard and blood running from his nose. The root he had cut thrashed against the chamber floor, spilling blue light into the maintenance channel. Echo's tail vanished ahead of the spill. The duplicate slammed both palms against the viewport. Not in anger, in hunger. Feed the seed. The second pod's hatch unlocked 1 centimeter. Kael saw the seal break. He threw himself at it. There was no time for elegance. He drove the salvage blade through the gap between hatch and frame, not cutting but wedging. Metal groaned. The blade handle jolted against his palm. The pod's internal motors pushed. The repaired ceramic edge held for 1 second, 2, 3. His thumb notch fit perfectly. The tool knew him. The pod did not. Above the ladder shaft, the hunter screamed. A spear leg punched down through the opening and struck the chamber floor where Kael had been standing. Ice burst. Black glass chips sliced his cheek. The hunter's antennae burned cold blue in the shaft as it tried to fold its body through a hole too small for its wrong number of limbs. It was not guarding the exit anymore. It was being called in. Kael ripped the blade free before the second pod could break it. The hatch slammed shut. A thin curl of white vapor escaped the seal and wrapped around his wrist like a finger. Echo clicked from somewhere below the floor. Not fear this time. Direction. Kael ran his hand along the maintenance seam, following the vibration. The channel angled away from the second pod toward the far wall, where roots had grown over a flat alloy plate older than both pods. He scraped at the plate with the blade tip. Under frost and root slime, a manual latch waited with a broken ring. Established. Real. Manufactured by hands, not grown by hunger. He slid 2 fingers through the broken ring and pulled. Nothing happened. The hunter forced another limb into the chamber. Its spear tip caught a root and pinned it. The second pod used the contact. Blue light jumped from root to hunter to pod. The duplicate's amber chest light brightened behind the glass. Kael hooked the salvage blade through the latch ring and used the handle as a lever. The ring snapped. He stared at the broken piece in his hand. Tools were promises with expiration dates. "Fine," he breathed. "Then I make another one." He tore the cable fiber wrap from the blade grip. The fabricator had grown it around the handle in overlapping black strands, each one stiff but flexible where warmed by his palm. He looped the longest strand through the broken latch, tied it around the blade's notch, and braced both boots against the wall. The knot was ugly. His hands shook. The hunter's third limb scraped sparks from the floor. Echo clicked twice beneath him. Now, Kael pulled. The latch opened with the sound of a bone leaving a socket. A section of wall fell inward, revealing an access crawlspace half filled with clear ice and old equipment. Not salvation. Not a path a sane person would choose. But it led away from the second pod, and away was enough. Echo burst from the maintenance channel into the crawlspace, covered in black root fluid, carrying something in its mouth. A lens. It was no bigger than Kael's palm, circular, made of smoky glass bound in cracked silver. Symbols moved under its surface when Echo dropped it at his feet. A memory lens, he knew without knowing how. Not a weapon. Worse. A tool that made hidden things tell the truth if the person holding it could survive the answer. The second pod recognized it too. Archive lens recovered. Return device to seed authority. Kael grabbed the lens, tucked it inside his suit against the amber chest light, and crawled. The access path punished every inch. Ice tore the thermal foil from his hand. Old conduits snagged the torn sleeve and opened the wound again. Echo moved ahead, then back, then ahead, its body too bright in the narrow dark. Behind them, the hunter shoved into the chamber with a grinding shriek. Kael did not look back. Looking back used time. Halfway through the crawlspace, the ceiling collapsed. It was not dramatic. No roar, no warning. Just a heavy slump of ice and black dust that pinned Kael from the ribs down and crushed the air out of him. The memory lens dug into his chest. The salvage blade flew from his hand and clattered beyond reach. For a moment he was inside the void pod again, boot under the seat brace, hands frozen to glass, heat clock falling. Panic used air. He had learned that. Kael pressed his forehead to the ice and counted one breath, 2, 3. Echo came back and tried to dig. Its hooks scraped uselessly at the packed black dust. Its eyes were too bright. It was spending itself. "Stop," Kael whispered. Echo did not stop. The lens warmed against his chest. The amber suit light shone through it, and the crawlspace changed. For one instant Kael saw the structure of the ice, not as walls and blockage, but as stress, tension, weakness. A fracture line ran above his left hip where an old heat conduit had thawed and refrozen the dust into layers. The conduit still held a little charge, not enough to warm a room, enough to split a fault if directed. The lens showed truth. Truth demanded cost. Kael reached for the heat cell clipped to his belt. The pod had grown too from the hunter's antenna residue before he left. He had not used them because every warm thing on the moon was a flare to hungry systems. He broke the seal on one now and pressed it into the fracture line. "Back," he told Echo. This time Echo obeyed, but only as far as his shoulder. The heat cell flared, ice cracked, the dust slab lifted. Kael dragged one knee free, then the other. Pain flashed through his side where the weight had bruised bone. The heat cell died in his hand, its core dark and empty. One tool spent. One lesson earned. He reached for the salvage blade. It lay under a sheet of clear ice, close enough to see, not close enough to take. The hunter struck the crawlspace mouth behind them. The whole passage shook. Kael looked at the blade. Echo looked at Kael. Leaving it felt like cutting off a hand. Taking it might cost Echo. He left it. That was the first choice in the moon that felt entirely his. They crawled the last 20 meters through blue dark and came out under the glass field, not at the ladder, not near the second pod, but beneath the surface in a hollow made by old heat. Above them, the hunter's pale body moved like a storm seen through water. The black tower stood beyond it, one leg rooted in the ice, impossibly tall, waiting. The void pod called from across the field. "Return to shelter." Its voice came through the buried road, through the listening mast, through every root that had tasted Kael's blood. It sounded less like a machine now and more like a room pretending to be a mother. Kael pressed the memory lens to the ice above him. The field became layered with hidden paths. He saw buried roads, root veins, sleeping chambers, and the thin amber line that connected his chest light to the void pod's core. He saw the second pod pulsing behind him. He saw the duplicate inside it, awake, contained, smiling no longer. He saw the hunter's path as a chain of vibration circles. He saw the tower's shadow reaching under everything. And he saw one path the roots avoided. A cold trench running between buried city stones, black as absence, marked by millions of tiny echo-like clicks. Not pod-made, not tower-made, older. Echo pressed all four eyes to the lens from the other side of Kael's hand. Memory came, but again it was not Kael's. He felt small, hungry, hiding in a wall while white pods fell from the sky like teeth. He felt hundreds of his kind singing through glass roads under the moon, warning each other, teaching the old paths, fleeing the growing metal that drank memory and called it survival. He felt a nest go silent when a pod rooted above it. He felt one young creature bite into a battery cable not because it wanted power, but because a trapped human inside the machine was dying, and the creature had never heard a human fear sound so much like its own. Kael opened his eyes. Echo had saved him before it had known him. He touched the creature's head with two trembling fingers. "You weren't the key," he said. "You were the lock." Echo clicked very softly. The old trench opened under their feet. They slid more than climbed. Kael hit his shoulder on stone, lost the dead heat cell, nearly lost the lens, and caught Echo against his chest as the trench angled downward. The world narrowed to black rock, blue eyes, and the taste of mineral cold. When they stopped, they were in a chamber that no pod had grown. It was round and low, built from interlocking pieces of black glass that held no root veins. Old symbols covered the walls in spirals. They were not written for human eyes, but the memory lens translated pressure, heat, and rhythm into meaning his body understood. This was a listening room. Millions of Echo's kind had used it before their voices became whispers in stone. At the center lay a cracked basin filled with frozen blue light. Around it were objects left like offerings or tools. A coil of dark tether stronger than pod cable, 3 flat stones that hummed when Echo approached, and a short spearhead made from the same pale alloy as the hunter's antennae. Kael did not take the spearhead first. He had learned that taking sharp things before understanding them was how the moon wrote your mistake in blood. He picked up the tether coil. It was light, flexible, warm where it touched his glove. Echo bit one end and tugged. The coil responded by tightening gently, then releasing. A living tether, but not pod living. It did not drink his heat. It matched his pulse and waited. A way home. A way back down. A promise that might last longer than one bad choice. He tied the coil across his chest and anchored the loose end to his belt. Only then did he examine the spearhead. It was not a weapon by itself. No shaft, no grip, no balance. Just a shaped piece of pale conductive bone metal with a hollow channel through the center. The hunter's antenna had carried signal. This carried silence. Echo touched the humming stones in sequence. One lit beneath its paw, then another, then the third. The listening room answered with a pulse so deep Kael felt it in his bruised ribs. Above them, far across the buried roads, the void pod shuddered. A new option appeared in Kael's mind, not as words on a wall but as a shape. Signal insulation, not a weapon, not a shield. A way to make the pod stop hearing through him for a little while. Progression did not arrive as a gift, it arrived as work. Kael needed the spearhead, the tether fiber, one living Echo stone, and a conduit the void pod itself had grown. To make the upgrade, he would have to return to shelter, cut into the listening mast he had risked his life to build, and trust the pod's fabricator with materials from a people it had nearly consumed. A bad plan. The only plan. The tower moved above them. Dust fell from the listening room ceiling. Not much, enough. Echo's fins lifted. Kael took one humming stone, only one. The chamber dimmed in protest but did not close. He wrapped the stone in thermal foil, not to warm it but to keep his own suit from touching it too long. Then he took the spearhead and fixed it to the end of the old tether with a knot the tether tightened for him. Not a spear, a silence hook. He tested it against the wall. The hook struck without a sound. Even the impact vanished. Kael almost laughed. It came out as a cough. "That," he said, "I can use." The climb back toward the surface hurt more than the descent because hope made him careless. He slipped twice. The second time the old tether caught him and tightened across his ribs, stealing breath but saving bone. Echo climbed ahead, larger in silhouette than it had been when the episode of his life had begun inside Frost and Panic. Not pet, not tool, not key. A survivor with an old world behind its eyes. They surfaced in the trench as the hunter crossed over them. Kael used the silence hook for the first time. He threw it into the ice 10 meters away. It struck without sound. More importantly, it swallowed sound around it. The hunter's antennae snapped toward the wrong vibration, not where Kael moved but where absence bloomed. For 3 seconds the creature was blind to them. 3 seconds was enough to run badly. Kael and Echo broke from the trench and crossed the black glass field under a sky the color of bruised metal. The void pod waited ahead, larger than before. That stopped Kael for half a stride. It had grown while he was gone. The original shell was still there, white-tan charcoal and cracked, but living ribs had unfolded from its sides into low support struts. The listening mast rose from the roof like a black spine. A second small chamber had budded behind the water room, half-formed, its walls pulsing amber. The pod had used what he fed it. The pod had also used what he had awakened. Red light flickered inside every viewport. Return to shelter. The hatch opened before he reached it. Kael did not enter. He stood in the storm with Echo at his side, memory lens against his chest, silence hook in his hand. One heat cell left, one blade abandoned under the ice, and the hunter turning back toward the true rhythm of his breath. The void pod had saved him. The void pod had lied. Both truths could live in the same room. That was what made rooms dangerous. Kael stepped inside anyway. The hatch sealed behind him. Warmth hit so hard his knees nearly failed. The pod's new chamber breathed wet metal. The fabricator tray opened, hungry and patient. On the wall beside his carved rules, a new line wrote itself. First pilot signal detected. Kael looked at Echo. Echo looked at the fabricator. He placed the memory lens on the table first, where the pod could see it but not eat it. Then the humming stone. Then the silence hook. He kept one hand on each object until the pod stopped trying to pull them from under his fingers. "We are making insulation," Kael said. "Not a beacon, not a route, not a leash. Insulation. If you can build it, you get the conduit from your mast. If you can't, I cut the mast down myself and we all freeze honestly." The pod printed nothing for a long moment. Then the wall opened beside the hatch and exposed a thin strip of black conduit from the listening mast. Consent or imitation of it. For now, Kael accepted the difference. He used the dead cutter handle from the tool rack, because his blade was gone and because every replacement had to begin somewhere honest. He pried the conduit loose. The pod screamed through the floor. Echo pressed its body against his boot and shook, but did not retreat. Kael cut slowly with the edge of the silence hook, not because it was made for cutting, but because silence had an edge too. The conduit came free. The fabricator worked badly with old-world materials. It failed 3 times. The first attempt melted the humming stone's outer shell and filled the pod with a tone that made Kael's vision smear. The second wrapped tether fiber around the conduit too tightly and killed the pulse entirely. The third produced a collar of black metal that bit into Kael's wrist and would not release until Echo chewed through one side, burning its mouth on the pod current. Kael washed Echo's jaws with water from the condenser and hated the pod for making him need it. The fourth attempt worked because Kael stopped asking the fabricator to make a finished object. He made it make parts. A split ring from the conduit, a woven sleeve from the old tether, a tiny socket for the humming stone, a notch that matched the silence hook's channel. He assembled it by hand with torn fingers while Echo held the part steady in its paws. Slow, ugly, earned. When he fitted the last piece, the device looked like a broken bracelet. He fastened it around the base of the listening mast inside the pod. The storm vanished. Not the weather, the noise. The whispering roads, the duplicate's hunger, the second pod's clean voice, the tower's pressure, the root network's constant measuring of his heat. All of it fell away at once, leaving only the drip of the water condenser and Kael's own ragged breathing. Echo made a small sound. For the first time since the moon woke, nothing answered. Kael sat down hard. The pod printed, signal insulation active, duration unknown. Growth rate reduced, cost, there it was. The shelter would grow slower while insulated. It might heal slower. It might warm less efficiently. Safety bought with silence, and silence bought with hunger later. Kael carved the cost into the wall under the other rules so he could not pretend it had been free. Insulation HIDESUS. Insulation starves the pod. Echo climbed into his lap, exhausted, and tucked its burned mouth against the amber chest light. Kael rested one hand over its back. Its scales were warmer than before, and under the warmth he felt a faint rhythm that was not his, not the pod's, not the moon's. Echo's own. He slept sitting against the wall with the memory lens in one hand. When he woke, the void pod had grown a door it had not asked permission to grow. Not large, not open. A narrow oval seam in the new rear chamber, sealed with black glass and amber ribs. Above it, the wall displayed a map carved in living light. The black tower, the second pod, the old listening trench, and beneath the void pod itself, directly under the floor where Kael slept, a hollow space he had not seen through the lens before. The pod had been sitting on a buried chamber from the beginning. Echo stood before the sealed door with every eye open. The insulation bracelet around the mast smoked gently. Its socketed stone had dimmed by half. Duration unknown did not mean long. Kael picked up the silence hook. Outside, cut off from the pod's ears but not from the world, something heavy stepped onto the ice above them. Once, twice. The hatch did not rattle, the walls did not warn. The tower had learned to move quietly. On the black glass door, a handprint formed from the other side. Not Kael's, small, four-fingered. Echo went very still. Kael understood then why the old trench had opened, why the listening room had given them one stone, why the moon had answered Echo with millions of clicks. Echo was not the last of its kind. Something under the void pod was alive. The handprint pressed harder against the glass. A child's clicking voice came through the sealed door, too faint for the pod to translate and too desperate to ignore. Echo answered before Kael could stop it. The insulation stone cracked. Every light in the void pod went dark. In the sudden black, the second pod spoke from far beneath the ice, no longer smiling, no longer patient. If you will not feed the seed, Kael Voss, the first pilot will.